Well, a very warm welcome to you. And thank you for being here as we come together for one purpose, which is to celebrate the life of Tom Marshall. My name is Stuart Holden. I'm a celebrant with Humanist UK. I've been asked by Tom's wife Catherine and children Adrian and Elisa to lead the proceedings here this lunchtime, so thank you all for coming here to support them. As you all know, Tom died in March. He was just 1 week short of his 99th birthday, and the purpose of this memorial service is both to share in sadness at his death, but also to honour his memory in the company of many of those who knew him and loved him. And you're all here today because you have that one important thing in common. Your lives have been touched by the good fortune of having known Tom in some capacity, and in that sense we're all bound together today by family and friendship. So today myself and others will touch on points of Tom's life that will mean different things to each of you, and that can evoke memories of him that you can take away from here and keep safe. So over the course of today, we hope that you learn more about both Thomas Marshall, CBE, and the many interesting aspects that made up his illustrious and impressive working life, but also Tom, the husband and the father and the grandfather, and today we'll pay tribute to everything that Tom was. Well, I know how much time and effort Catherine has put into making today just right, and in this respect it helps that you may not be surprised to know that Tom himself took a very pragmatic and stoic approach to planning his own memorial service, and by doing so much of the preparation himself, of course, what he really wanted was to ensure that Catherine and Adrian and Elisa didn't have to worry about what to do too much when this time came. So a religious church service would not be for Tom. He may have been born into the Church of England, but as he put it, the later studies that he undertook of Darwinian theory and advances in cosmology and other things led him to the view that our existence is limited to our lifespan on planet Earth. Humanists believe that because there's no life but this, look after us but ourselves, we should seek to live life fully and well for our own benefit and for the benefit of others, and those are values that Tom certainly exemplified throughout his life. The focus today should be on Tom's life, but it would be important to know that everyone here knows that they're warmly welcome, regardless of belief or background. Now, in his extensive notes for today, Tom wrote that he believed that power and fame and fortune are, for most of us, ephemeral and fleeting, a viewpoint that's well described in this famous Percy Shelley poem, Ozymandias, which Tom wished to be included today, Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. So yes, this is Tom's memorial carried out exactly in accordance with his wishes, and yes, he contributed very largely to his own eulogy. In fact, it's more of an autobiography, and Tom asked his son Adrian to share his words with you today, and Adrian's going to do so now in addition to some memories of his own. So this is Tom's story as told by him. Adrian.
Thanks, Stuart. Hello everyone. Thank you very, very much for coming to this gathering in memory of my father, Tom. And we're very pleased that you've joined with Catherine. Where is Catherine? There she is, Catherine. And our family, Elisa, my sister, in this recollection of my dad's life, and we're going to say goodbye to him. Now, as you know, Dad's profession dealt with death. He was well used to it. And also, as with a lot of old people, he recognized it was going to happen eventually, and he didn't fear it. He planned for it. So last October, when Elisa was over from America, and we were all together, we discussed it quite openly. And Dad gave me this, which is his funeral address. And he'd written it all himself. And so for the next 15 or so minutes, the words are in fact his words. As you've heard, my father didn't believe in heaven. If there was to be any form of afterlife for him, he thought it would reside in people's memories. My purpose today is to sketch Tom's life and hopefully to reinforce those memories. His afterlife will reside in you just as long as your memories survive. That is all that he would have wished for. And at this point, I'm going to say, if I get a little bit emotional during any of this, hope you forgive me. Dad was born in Bradford, Yorkshire, on the 28th of March, 1924. His parents, my grandparents, were what you would call middle class. His father was a surveyor and a valuer, and his mother looked after the house, which was the custom in those days. In 1928, Tom got a brother, Derek, who unfortunately died in 2016. There were no other siblings. In 1928, the family moved to Morecambe, and there Dad did well at the local authority primary school. He was no genius, rather a plodder, but he could be relied upon to pass examinations. And in 1939, he obtained the school certificate with a credit in 8 subjects. Around about this time, his parents split up, and Tom returned to Bradford with his mother and his brother, where they got a council house, and his mother found a job in a department store. They had just enough money to live on respectably. Tom was placed in Form 1 of a local authority secondary school. It's now called Grange Grammar School. And the teaching in Morecambe seems to have been quite advanced, because after the first year in Bradford, Tom was leapfrogged into Form 3, which caused him to miss taking chemistry as a subject. However, he had a good grounding in physics and maths, which he enjoyed. And then higher school certificate followed. This was the 6th form, and he was in the 6th form when World War II broke out, and he helped at the school to fit the local people with gas masks. After a few months in the 6th form, Tom left school to work for a Dr. Franklin, who was a radiologist in Bradford, and Tom looked after his private practice based in the grounds of Bradford Royal Infirmary. And there he learnt his trade as a radiographer. He attended night school, where he continued with his physics and maths, and he started to learn chemistry. Now, unfortunately, within a year, his boss, the radiologist, he had a bad stroke, and Tom had to run the radiography practice alone with locum radiologists calling in to do the screening and report on the films. Tom was 17, and he always looked back at this phase of his life as crucial for building his confidence and his social development. Now, one winter's day in 1941, his music master at school fell on the ice, and he was admitted to Bradford Royal Hospital. Tom heard about it, and he paid him a visit on the ward, and when they were talking about his future, Tom said that he intended to do an external BSc in physics at London University with the aim of becoming a radium physicist, whatever that is. The music master urged him to do a full-time degree at Leeds University. So Tom sought the advice of a boy living in his district who went to Leeds University. It turned out that this boy was studying medicine, not physics. And the outcome of the conversation was that Tom was persuaded to try for medicine. But where to raise the money? His mother had none. The Bradford Education Authority laughed at his aspiration. His salvation came from Leeds University itself, when the academic sub-dean, a chap called Archie Durwood, professor of anatomy, he interviewed Dad at length and offered him a fee-paying scholarship. But there was a crucial proviso. Dad would have to go back to school and get his higher school certificate, the equivalent of today's A-levels. So it was February, and Tom left his job at once, went back to sixth form at school, and started studying for the higher certificate. He only had about 6 months, and in the end, he did achieve a good in physics and a pass in chemistry and maths, and it was sufficient for Leeds University to accept him. For the next 5 years, his mother managed to maintain him at university. His aunt contributed modestly to his bank account, and he earned a little by working as a locum radiographer. He says his time at Leeds was uneventful. I don't believe that for 1 minute, but he's not admitting to anything. He says he was an average student who passed his exams. The only distinction he earned was in forensic medicine, but he never knew why. In the 5th year, he agreed to be the only doctor. He wasn't a doctor, he was a medical student. But he was doing a 2-week locum job in a cottage hospital in a nearby market town. Medicine was more relaxed in those days. During his stint there, he x-rayed people, he tested miners' eyes, he amputated a finger, and with the assistance of the local GP, he took out a girl's appendix. At Leeds General, one quiet afternoon, he was commandeered by a consultant surgeon to give an anaesthetic with ether to a baby. He'd never done it before. Anyway, the baby survived, but how times have changed. After qualifying in March 1948, his connection with Bradford Royal Infirmary got him a senior medical houseman's post, where he found himself responsible for 2 of the 4 medical wards. It was just before the National Health Service came in, and the medical side of the hospital consisted of 2 housemen, each with 2 32-bed wards, loosely supervised by a resident medical officer, and consultants were honorary, and they would call in a couple of times a week to make sure everything was going okay. The houseman worked 24 hours a day and could leave the hospital only briefly by arranging with another houseman to provide cover. They slept on the premises, and if a patient complained during the night, the houseman had to get out of bed and sort things out. Dad told me that one accepted this state of affairs without question, because it was hands-on doctoring, and that's how you learnt your trade. He had a fairly free hand on the ward, and he found it one of the happiest periods of his career. He got free board and lodgings. At first he was paid 10 shillings a week, but after 3 months the health service came in and his salary increased to 30 shillings per week. Big bucks. After 6 months on the wards, he was called up for national service, and he elected to join the RAF. He was sent to Aden, where he found himself a medical officer in an Arab army, the Aden Protectorate Levies. He was one of 4 doctors running a bungalow hospital about 5 miles out of Aden town itself. He took over the X-ray department and the path lab, and in spite of the humidity and the prickly heat, he enjoyed his time there. Back in Bradford in June 1952, Dad started looking for a job. Professor Paulson at the University Forensic Department in Leeds was looking for a lecturer, and after a chat, Dad was offered the job. The University Senate was not happy. A doctor of only 26 years old with no experience of the subject does not usually become a full-time university lecturer. Fortunately, Professor Paulson got his way, and Dad's university career was launched. Professor Paulson was a fine teacher. He taught Dad to study in detail, to be meticulous, to choose words carefully and write accurately, and perform an autopsy as if wearing evening dress. Dad's settled circumstances now enabled him to marry my mother, a seasoned ward sister in Leeds General Infirmary, and that was in 1953. I and my sister came along in the next 4 years. After 8 years in the forensic job, Dad felt it was time to move on. And when the post of State Pathologist for Northern Ireland was advertised, he applied. A rather formidable appointment board of some dozen members, including the Lord Chief Justice, the Vice-Chancellor, and Professor Bigot, they interviewed him. He was successful, and when he started work in a room in the Pathology Institute on October the 1st, 1958, the Department of Forensic Medicine was born. Everyone told him, "We don't have murders in Northern Ireland." But on the 4th day of the job, Dad got a call to the Old Park district where a woman had been stabbed by a relative. That was his first case as state pathologist, and from then on, there were always murders in the books. In those days, there were 20 coroners in Northern Ireland. 10 of them were doctors, 10 were lawyers. During October 1958, Dad paid them all a visit. He found that coroners ordered very few autopsies. One coroner ordered none at all. So Dad concluded that a province-wide autopsy service was needed, and he set about developing it. There was no blueprint. There was no precedent he had to follow. He just did what he thought was right, what would work. Fortunately, Ulster was the right size, and he was also able to influence the provisions of a new Coroners Act in 1959, then going through the Stormont Parliament. Autopsies were to be carried out for coroners on request, without charge, and the coroners quickly took advantage of this. During the 1960s, the number of autopsies carried out annually rose to about 1,300. Autopsies were ordered in cases of sudden death, which in those days would mainly have been heart attacks, strokes, and road traffic accidents. This increase in forensic work allowed Tom to appoint 2 trainees, Dr. Carson and Dr. Press. He trained them both in forensic work which was quite different from hospital pathology. Dad enjoyed teaching, and during the 1960s his small team was joined at intervals by trainees from India, Sudan, Singapore, Sri Lanka, and then Dr. Ferris came from Grey Abbey. The 1960s were fruitful and happy days for the forensic department. When the Troubles started in 1970, the trainees faded away, and the forensic department's work increased enormously. It had to carry out all the autopsies on deaths from the Troubles, and these were usually difficult and time-consuming, and they did this on top of the normal coroner's work. 1972 was the worst year when Tom and his two colleagues dealt with the 1,300 normal coroner's cases, plus 310 shooting deaths and 143 deaths from explosions. Now, forensic pathology, Dad says here, was an exotic speciality, and it was then impossible to get more assistance. In 1 month alone, in July 1972, they dealt with 100 deaths from shootings and bombings, sufficient to break the back of a well-staffed medical legal department. But gradually over the years, the volume of work started to subside, and the department survived. Yet recovery took time, and even when Dad retired in October 1989, it took him another 3 months to deal with the backlog of reports. After he retired, Jack Crane, who's here today and is going to say a few words, he'd been a trainee of Dad's, and he took over from him. Dad told me his working life was a satisfying one, and he thought that the greatest achievement was the establishment of the Northern Ireland Coroner's Autopsy Service, which is still going strongly today. His work brought him recognition. He was awarded the CBE for his services to Northern Ireland, and also he was president of the International Association of Forensic Sciences, twice president of the British Association of Forensic Medicine, twice president of the Northern Ireland Medical Legal Society. He lectured in at least 10 countries, some of them quite frequently. His research was published in about 4 dozen papers and chapters in textbooks. My dad's work brought some strain to our domestic arrangements, and in 1966 my parents separated, followed by a divorce 20 years later. Happily, my parents remained in touch and developed a friendly and helpful relationship. Dad retired in 1989 after 30 years in post. 9 months later, in 1990, he married Catherine. She had worked in Tom's department for 16 years, so she knew what she was taking on. She retired too when she married, and they were free to travel far and often. But as the last 5 years unfolded, my dad's health deteriorated, and Catherine has worked devotedly as Tom's carer. Through her, Dad remained out of hospital and not in a care home. We hope that as the future unfolds, Catherine does not fall beneath your radar. That is what Dad gave me to say. So that's my father's life as written by my father. And I found it very interesting that he's given us such a detailed insight into his early life and then speeded through the last 30 years since retirement. But I think it's wonderful that his last words are about Catherine. She supported him so devotedly. We all love her. She's an angel. And she listened to his story. she would have realised all of this. Thank you for that round of applause. Now, I don't want you to think, none of us are. Dad has said that he lives on in our memories, but my memories of him when I was a child are limited. People who are successful in their jobs often spend too much time working and not enough time with their families. Dad was guilty of this. But some of my happiest memories are of holidays in a cottage near Sligo that we rented. Dad had visited the area first when he was a student, and he stayed on a farm with the Dennison family. And I'd like to thank Anne Dennison, as was, for coming here today. She's known him longer than anybody. Now, as Dad's already told you, he and Mum separated, and that meant that Lisa and I didn't see as much of him as we would have liked. But Eliza was an exceptional swimmer, international standard. And in 1972, Dad took us both to a weekend swimming gala in Tuam. And on the way home, we went via Sligo, and he showed us a derelict cottage that he had bought. He renovated it, and it became a boat hole for him and Catherine. In 2016, I retired, and I took over that cottage. And this required frequent visits to organise building work, and I combined that with visits to Belfast to stay with Dad and Catherine. So it's since then that I got time to spend more time with him, and it's been lovely. We had long conversations, often over a meal cooked by Catherine, and it's been fascinating to know all his stories from a long and interesting life. I'm very proud of him. Dad died on the 19th of March, aged 98. He was 1 week short of his 99th birthday. He was mentally alert up to the end. He was interested and interested. His heart eventually let him down, but he died peacefully at home with Catherine at his side. He enjoyed living in Belfast. He enjoyed going down to the cottage. He enjoyed travel. He loved his job. He loved his garden. He loved music. He loved his art. He loved his stamps. He loved talking to people. But most of all, he loved Catherine. His ashes have been buried, according to his wishes, at Creevely Priory in Dromahair, which is in County Leitrim. It's not far from the cottage. Tomorrow we're going down with a memorial stone to place on top of his ashes at the Abbey. It's a lovely, peaceful and atmospheric place, near the river where we used to fish. If you're down in that direction, Dad would love you to pay him a visit. So there it is. Dad's had the most wonderful, happy, long, and fulfilling life. He's lived life to the full. And he lives on in our memories. I'd like you to give him a big round of applause.
I'd like to give Adrian a round of applause as well. Well done for surviving the heckling by your grandchildren as well. extra impressive. But I'm going to hand over now actually to Elisa, who has a few words also to share with you.
Well, this is brief. This is brief. I always knew that my dad was an impressive man. Now I know, way more. But not because he ever told me or he even alluded to it, but really just by the way other people responded to him. But to me, he was just my dad. So let me tell you a little bit about that. Dad, it was important to impart life lessons of some kind. Some of my earliest memories are going for a walk, holding his hand, and having to trot alongside him in order to keep up. He refused to slow down. He told me, you have to keep up in life so as not to get left behind. He would make up bedtime stories for me, my favorite being when he was a little boy, teaching me not to lie, steal, be rude or unpleasant. Dad's cautionary tales, all made up on the spot. My dad taught me to fish, how to pluck a chicken, and to cure car sickness by looking at a squash fly on a windshield. He taught me how to row a boat, use a camera, and gave me tips on how to make a good home brew, although that was debatable. We made cheesecakes together, many cheesecakes, which he renamed with each attempt, changing one small detail in the recipe. Dad's cheesecake, Mach 1, 2, 3, 4, and I think we got to about 17 before perfection. My dad taught me how to look at art and appreciate the skill with which artists use their tools. He taught me, I have cataracts. He taught me about music and how to identify a single instrument in an orchestra. He taught me about food from other countries, for example, how Indian cuisine contains so many spices, but when they come together, they create exotic aromas and flavors. I guess my dad rubbed off on me more than either one of us knew as I became a visual artist who worked in the music industry, and my passion is cooking. After my dad died, I was at home and became aware of a Persian rug in my hallway that he had once admired. He told me that he could tell that it was handmade rather than machine-made by the mistakes in the pattern and how that made it special. Thinking of that made me think about how much my dad enjoyed people and how he would always find the special in them. No matter a person's status, religion, culture, occupation, or wealth, my dad was interested in their soul. I think this is probably the most important thing he ever taught me, and I believe that this is his legacy. Thank you.
Thank you, well done. Well, we've heard the name Jack Crane mentioned a couple of times already, and Jack, I understand, has a few words also to share with you, so Jack, I'm going to hand over to you, sir.
Sure. Some of you here will have been taught by Tom Marshall, and his lectures were very famous. When I said that I would say a few words of this, I was told I wasn't to speak longer than 5 minutes. Tom's lectures went on for an hour and a half sometimes. The students used to get very restless and so forth, but they all enjoyed his lectures because he was a superb lecturer. Some of the sentiments that Adrian mentioned and Tom had asked him to say, I remember well, because whenever I started as a trainee I tended to do postmortems, and there was blood everywhere on the walls, and Tom said, you should be able to do a postmortem with your dinner jacket on. I don't know whether he ever did that or not. I certainly didn't try, but he was meticulous in having everything clean and neat and tidy. And he also taught me about the language you used in the report. He said, whenever you write your reports, he said, think of the fact that you're going to stand up, and there's a few barristers here, and read out your report in front of them, so make sure your language is precise and accurate. And he used to check my reports whenever I was still training, and they were written in longhand, and then Tom would check them. And whenever he checked them, there was more red ink on them than most black ink, because he was correcting everything, the grammar and how I said things. And that was the sort of person he was, very meticulous. When I became state pathologist, and I've done quite a lot of travelling as Tom did, what's interesting is that Tom's name is well known in forensic circles, not just in the United Kingdom, but indeed all over the world. Tom particularly made a very intense study of injuries caused by bomb blasts, and he described the type of injuries that you get from explosion injuries. And whenever you go abroad, they all talk about Marshall's triad, and this was the particular type of injury you see in people who are really close to bombs. So that name lives on in forensic circles. During the Troubles, we didn't have the advantage of being able to X-ray, and I know there's a radiologist here in the audience, but we didn't have the advantage of doing X-rays. And when we were looking for bullets, you would be poking around and trying to find the bullets. And bullets were extremely difficult to find. And one time Tom came back, I think he'd been abroad, and he came back and he said, guess what I've got? He says, I've got a little metal detector. He says, and we can use this to find bullets. He said, oh. So the next shooting we have, I goes over to Foster Green, as we used then, with Tom. Tom was doing the case, and I was writing his notes. And he says, let's try this metal detector. So he puts the metal detector on the body, and it lights up and makes a buzzing noise. See, look, see, there's a bullet there. And then he went down a bit further, and it lit up, and it sounded the noise again. And he said, look, there's another bullet there. And he kept on going down the body, and it kept on buzzing and so forth. And you don't sort of speak back to Professor Marshall, you know, but I said, Professor, there's a slight problem here. And he says, what? He says, the table's metal. Of course, he was going up and down. This thing was going on. He sort of threw it in the corner. Professor Marshall, and again this was alluded to, regarded being able to meet people and socialise with them. And that was very important to him. And whenever we went to meetings of the British Association in Forensic Medicine, Tom said it's always very important to meet your colleagues in a social sort of setting as well as formally. And he says, you'll get more out of that. So whenever I was hosting the British Association in Forensic Medicine meeting in Belfast, and I contacted Tom and said, come along. And he said, oh yes, I'd like to. So he rang me up and he said, is there any social events? And I said, yes, there are. So he said, oh good. So I said, on the Friday, I said, we're having a reception at Hillsborough Castle. And he said, yes, Catherine and I'll go to that. And then he rang me again and he said, the meeting's on Saturday. I said, yes. I said, there's a dinner on Saturday night. He says, yes, Catherine and I'll go to that. And then he said, and you're having people around your house on Sunday? I said, yes. He says, we'll be there. And I said, what about the meeting? And he says, oh no, I'll not bother going to that. So, as well as working hard as he did, and I remember as a trainee, you know, working late in the department and maybe working to 8 o'clock at night studying for my exams. Tom would often be there working as well, because he was very dedicated to the job, and he would work late like me, but he also knew how to enjoy life. And we had great time together. I owe an awful lot to him. Whenever I became state pathologist, I owe the training that he gave me, which was superb. He was a fantastic lecturer, certainly one of the best lecturers that I know, both as to undergraduates and indeed to postgraduates. And he leaves a legacy in forensic medicine of setting up the State Pathology Service, which is still going today and still going strong. I've retired, there's new state pathologists now, and that department is still going well. And he commanded the respect of everybody in the medical profession and in the legal profession as well. And it was an honour and a privilege to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Well, yes, you mentioned some barristers being present, and I understand that John McCrudden is one of them and also has something to share with us. So, John, I'm going to ask you up to the front if you would, sir, please.
It's very unfortunate for a barrister to have to say this, but much of my thunder has been stolen by Adrian and by Jack Crane, but I'll have to make the best of it. I heard that Tom was retiring in, I'm reminded, 1989, and I thought, Tom Marshall, who was a legend in his own lifetime and continues to be a legend, has retired. And I made a point of snapping him up immediately to do defence work, to challenge the Crown, to challenge the prosecution on their cases. And we did many memorable cases together: murders, manslaughters, poisoning, strangulation, bombs, bullets, you name it. As I think it was Adrian said, or perhaps it was Jack, he dealt in death, and that's what we do. And it's not exactly the most envied of areas to work in, but he, as everyone, as the contributions thus far have indicated, he mastered his profession from beginning to end. He was a giant of a pathologist. He bestrode his profession like a colossus. And as Jack Crane has said, and Jack follows in his footsteps in more ways than one, as Jack has said, his delivery, his succinctness, his precision, his economy of language, and his being able to convey complicated medical legal propositions and assessments and assertions to the ordinary man in the street. And there were 12 ordinary men and women in the street, on the juries, and they had to be communicated with. They had to understand what these complicated matters were about. And as Jack again has said, in his reports and in his oral evidence, he brought precision, definition, clear analysis, and clear explanation of that into a new realm of excellence. His medical reports were sparse. They were, as I say, economical in expression and in analysis. I was often surprised if they reached 3 pages, but every word and every sentence counted. He didn't waste a full stop, he didn't waste a word, he didn't put in 3 words where one would do. He was a master of communication. So I fast forward in his lifetime, my experience of him, my knowledge of him, my friendship with him, to Christmas, before and after Christmas passed. And we had a succession of emails, communicated with each other, and which touches on the thing that Tom embraced with a heart and a hand, was the internet. Tom became a master of the internet. He loved the internet because of the wealth of knowledge that was there, literally at his fingertips. That which could be assessed, that which could be understood, and that which could be done with such rapidity. He was amazed and not overwhelmed, but as I say, embraced the internet with every fibre of his being. The last email I got from Tom was on the 2nd of February, 6 weeks or so before his untimely death. When you say it was untimely, you may think that's a strange thing to say, but had I been a betting man, I would have bet easily. I would have put my jacket on it, my shirt on it, that he would have made 100, and I was very disappointed in that he didn't make 100. And so you'll forgive me, Tom, for that slight criticism, but it wasn't for the one. It wasn't for the one of trying. And he ranged variously over, and as Jack has said, his precision, and as Adrian has said, his mental acuity was as sharp as a tack right until the end, certainly right until the end of my communications with him. And he ranged variously over a number of topics in that last email, one of which was the, as you'll all be familiar with it, the 8th century kingdom of Lotharingia. And he drew it to my attention and explained to me how Lotharingia, I don't no doubt mispronounce it terribly as usual, had been a European kingdom which had been founded by a grandson of Charlemagne, as you all be familiar with, in the 8th century, and that was Lothar II. That little tidbit of information lit up his mind, and he was reading about this. He also indicated to me that, and this was the 2nd of February, he said he had his eye on the 14th of February. And not, he assured me, because it was St. Valentine's Day. Tom was no Jew-eyed romantic. It was because he explained to me that when the 14th of February came, he knew he could that was the beginning of spring, the end of winter. How did he know that? Because he said in his, I loved his Yorkshire accent, he said, well, I used to be able to drive back from the Royal without putting my car lights on. You might think it's the first bird or bar of spring or whatever, but for Tom, it was the ability or the lack of necessity to put his car lights on. He was a person, as we've heard, of extensive knowledge, extensive travel. China, India, Sligo, Malta. He loved to talk about Malta and the colour of the brickwork and the setting sun in Malta. He particularly liked to tell me and explain to me about the house down near Sligo, which Adrian has already addressed. Now, Adrian said he's made many rehabilitative changes to the house, and I understand that it retains the old facade and the beauty. Tom assured me that in his day, he said, with no electricity, he was proud of that, and with no water. How do you do without water? Well, Catherine explained to me, no, there's no water inside, the water was outside, and apparently there's a picture of him somewhere standing outside filling a kettle with water. But that was Tom all over. He was meticulous, he was wordy, he was knowledgeable, and he was down to earth, and his feet were rooted in the earth of Sligo, or near to Sligo. He had great stories about the troubles. He used to tell me, again, going home, whether with lights on or off, he would often be stopped at roadblocks by armed men, not all of whom wore official uniform. And he explained how he got through them by explaining to them that he was a doctor, and they let him through, regardless of whoever they were. The troubles, as Jack has said, almost, and he was right, almost overwhelmed the department. Nobody can imagine, in such a small society as Northern Ireland, that nobody from outside it can really read about it, see it on television, but to grasp the enormity of the death toll that occurred here, and how Tom and his successors, including Jack, handled that, it was beyond me, and they did sterling work in the troubles in conducting all the autopsies and examinations that they did. But Tom's first public prominence, if you like, was with the case of McGladrey. McGladrey was a man who was prosecuted for the the death of a young lady called Pearl Gamble in 1959 or so. McGladrey was tried before a judge and jury in Belfast. I think it was in Belfast. He was sentenced to death. McGladrey was the last man to be convicted, last man rather to be sentenced to death. He was executed in Belfast prison, and Tom, I don't know if he was a colleague of Tom's, but it was a Yorkshire man who hanged him, a Yorkshire man called Allen, whom they brought over from England to hang McGladrey. And Tom always was very proud of the fact that he had made the connection between McGladrey was a joiner, and he had a special tool with file, a rasp as it known as, and Tom matched up the sort of thing that Jack did too, matched up the pattern on the hasp with the wound. I'm sorry to go into these gory details on Pearl Gamble's back. In any event, McGladrey hanged, and that was the last hanging, last execution in Northern Ireland. Before that, Jack reminded me, shortly before that, the person who donned the black cap, as was traditional then when you sentenced someone to death, was Lord Justice Curran, who some short time before his daughter had been murdered near White Abbey, and that case was revisited, I think, within the last 15 years, and Ian Hay Gordon, who Joe McCriskin, the present coroner, reminds me, and both Jack and he reminded me that Ian Hay Gordon was exonerated and the conviction was quashed for that murder. In any event, Tom's daughter Alicia and her family are here from, I understand, from Connecticut, and they will probably know, I'm sure Alicia will know, that the greatest atrocity, the greatest terrorist atrocity that was conducted on American soil prior to 9/11 was the Oklahoma bombing, which occurred back some considerable time before the Oklahoma bombing. And as Jack said, the go-to person for injuries from shrapnel, from bullets, from whatever cause, was Tom Marshall. I hadn't heard of the Marshall triad internationally until Jack explained it to us. But he was, so the defenders of Timothy McVeigh, who was prosecuted for the Oklahoma bombing, scoured the world to find who would we go to. And of course, they went to Tom, which was a matter of great regret for Catherine, because she said there were 168 autopsies, and Tom, as again Jack said, had each of them meticulously a pillar of paper for each of the 168 people who perished in that bombing in Oklahoma in her drawing room, and they occupied that room for the greater part of his time. And he had a theory which he expounded before the jury in America, that there was a third man there, that Timothy McVeigh, defense case was that Timothy McVeigh wasn't there. He was not the person who'd done the bombing. It was another person. And Tom had found a spare leg. Everything matched for the autopsies, whatever was left of people. I'm sorry again to go into this sort of gory detail. It all fitted except this spare leg. And Tom explained to me how there was a Volkswagen camper van or something of that sort used to convey the bomb. And he reckoned that the bomber had put 1 foot down on the ground. Or sorry, 1 foot was still left in the camper van as he stepped down. The bomb went off, the camper van was blown to pieces, everything around it was atomized except this leg. And this showed that it wasn't McVeigh, it was whoever had owned the spare leg that didn't fit anybody else. And I said to Tom, how did that go? And with classic understatement, Tom says, Judge didn't think much of it, John.
John, I think your microphone's packed up. Maybe we should move on.
I'd be quite...
I don't think this one's working.
All right, sorry. Well, I'll draw my remarks to a close. what was Tom Marshall's legacy? Well, his legacy has been spoken to. It's his reputation as the awe, and it's not an excessive word to use to deal with his memory and his legacy, the awe in which he was held. His legacy went further than that. He left 2 stars in his wake. One, a very obvious one who succeeded him, and it was Jack Crane, as State Pathologist for Northern Ireland, who filled Tom's shoes and was someone who Tom had great time for. He mentored him, and he, as Jack has very well indicated, had taught him well, and that shows in Jack's work. And Jack now is the go-to man to appear for the defence here. The other star is a much more unlikely candidate. We had a Christmas party one year at home, and Tom and Catherine were there. I saw my son Peter Michael chatting very avidly, as I thought, with Tom. I said, "What were you talking to Tom about?" Well, he asked me what I did, and did you tell him? Well, in a nutshell, Peter Michael was, and I use the word advisedly, was lost the term now, my wife will no doubt mouth it to me, an actuary. And Tom said, "What does that entail?" I said, "It entails doing a forensic anticipation or forecast based on statistical likelihood for macro and microeconomic matters. That's it in a nutshell." And I said, "What did Tom say?" And he said, he was very blunt. I said, "What did he say?" He said, "Sounds very boring to me." Not too many years later, Peter Michael retired from advocacy, and he's now a rock star playing electric guitar in Melbourne, in California, in Belfast, you name it.
Thomas Cole is an old friend who I understand is going to say a few words to you all as well. So Thomas.
I feel a little bit of a fraud actually standing up here, given the company that is present. But I was a medical student in the early 1970s, graduated in 1976, and I have 2 stories that I would like to recount to you. One Sunday, she wasn't my wife then, but my wife of more than 45 years and I were having a very slap upmarket lunch in Bostock House, which is in the nurses' home in the Royal Victoria Hospital. And when we looked around, who did we see over at the far side but T.K. Marshall? And you wouldn't normally have seen him in the Bostock canteen on an ordinary day of the week, but on a Sunday this seemed rather strange. So we actually went over and said to him, "Just a minute, what are you doing here? Right? You know, it doesn't seem right." And of course he was involved in doing post-mortems on people who had been very severely and significantly mutilated in one of the bombs of the so-called Troubles. Knowing that I might have the opportunity of saying this, I looked up, and this must have been the Strand bar on the Short Strand, just judging from the number of bodies that were in the morgue when we went around to watch and observe what was kind of happening. I'm reminded of the very important politicians who have said there is no hierarchy of victims, well, except for, and it seems to me that this is a series of victims who I haven't heard them mentioned in the last 40 years. However, we went round to the morgue and the bodies were all present, and my wife, and I'd call her that now, and I were looking at particularly the kind of last one, and we were thinking, how can this be sort of described, just the injuries and so on that were there? And I can almost hear him when he came to that particular body, and he stood and looked, and it has been said about the accuracy and the careful use of language and so on, but he came across and he looked and he said, there is a laceration 45 centimetres by 35 centimetres. And I thought, how can you just manage to be so careful and precise? And that is exactly what was there. Now, it may very well be that part of that may have influenced my choice to become an ophthalmologist, because, of course, avoiding dealing with bodily fluids and so on may be why I chose to follow that particular route. The other, I've been told on pain of death, if I go for more than 5 minutes, I may have my toenails pulled out one by one without the benefit of local anaesthetic, so I'll go as fast as I can. The second story I want to recount was when I was doing my forensic medicine exam. And in those days, I don't know whether it still happens, all exams included a written paper, which may have been essays, may have been multiple choice, or may have been both, and then followed by an oral. And I was having my oral for the forensic medicine exam. And the two examiners were T.K. Marshall and the external examiner, whose name I don't remember. But I remember him as being a very short, silver-haired, softly spoken southerner. I believe he may have come from Galway. So after we had the usual run of gruesome pictures to describe and make sense of, and then some questions about the law and whether it was subsection C or subsection E that applied, the external examiner said, "No," he said, "and God forbid that this should happen." He said, "But if you were going to commit suicide, how would you do it?" And I said, "Well, I think that I would have to take a very large dose of barbiturates, jump off a bridge over fresh water with a noose round my neck, tied to the bridge. And as I'm falling, I would plan to shoot myself in the head." And he kind of smiled a little bit. I said, "But I heard there was a guy who actually tried this. And the trouble was that he was such a bad shot that he fired through the rope. When he hit the water, he vomited up the tablets, and there was a boat passing which saved him." At which point the two examiners laughed out loud, and I mean,
Well, I'm conscious that we have hot food at the back of the room, but we have important things to get through first. Two more poems. Catherine is going to read something, and I'll finish off with the second one, which was of Tom's choosing. So, not Catherine, but Adrian's wife, Catherine. I'm going to invite to speak to you all now, Catherine. No luck with this.
Right, so there is no amplification, so I will call on my teaching skills to project my voice to you. So, as has been made clear in Adrian's speech to you, Tom believed his afterlife resides in your memories. And so he asked me if I would read this poem by Lyman Hancock about memories. When I come to the end of my journey, and I travelled my last weary mile, just forget, if you can, that I ever frowned, and remember only the smile. Forget unkind words I have spoken, remember some good I have done. Forget that I ever had heartache, and remember I had loads of fun. Forget that I've stumbled and blundered, and that sometimes I fell by the way. Remember, I fought some hard battles and won ere the close of the day. Then forget to grieve for my going. I would not have you sad for a day. And in summer, just gather some flowers and remember the place where I lay. And come in the shade of the evening, when the sun paints the sky in the west, and stand a few moments beside me. Remember only the best. Catherine would like us as well just to, if we're all together, say the Lord's Prayer.
Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, now and forever. Amen.
Well, many thanks to everyone who's spoken today. I'm going to take the easy option of standing closer to you as well, just to say that really thank you all for coming here to honour the life of this very lovely and respected man. Tom would certainly not have wanted any doom and gloom today, and I hope that he would feel that we've done him justice. This is the time for you to continue the conversation about him and share your own memories of him with love and laughter with the imminent arrival of food as well, which will always go down well. And I know that Catherine and Adrian and Elisa and others would like to really hear your stories and memories of Tom. So I'm going to leave you with another poem that Tom also chose today. It's written by Helen Lowry Marshall, no relation to Tom. It's entitled Afterglow. I'd like the memory of me to be a happy one. I'd like to leave an afterglow of smiles when life is done. I'd like to leave an echo whispering softly down the ways of happy times and laughing times and bright and sunny days. I'd like the tears of those who grieve to dry before the sun of happy memories that I leave when life is done. We can have some more music to entertain us as well.